Section 15 of Recollections of a Busy Life by William B. Forwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Churches. In my young days, eloquent preachers were still much in the fashion, and attracted large congregations, but the building of churches and appointing to them preachers of eminence as a financial speculation had happily ceased. The church in Liverpool was largely recruited from Ireland, and we had certainly many able men, who were not only eloquent, but whose discourses were also very lengthy. The hearing of sermons was not merely an act of devotion, but a form of religious entertainment and enjoyment, and a short discourse would not have been appreciated. I remember one very eloquent divine, to whose church it was impossible to obtain admission unless you were at the door a quarter of an hour before the service commenced, being, when advanced in years, removed to another church. He continued to preach the same sermons with much of his old fire and vigour, but he emptied the church, for people would no longer tolerate 50 minutes every Sunday of the old-fashioned controversial discourse. We had in those days many eminent divines: Dr. Lowe at St. Jude's, Dr. Taylor at St. Silas, Dr. Falloon at St. Bride's, and Dr. Ewbank at Everton, and most eloquent of all, Dr. McNeill at St. Paul's, Prince's Park. He was a great power both in the pulpit and the platform, and in the press. Clergy and laity, rich and poor, were stirred by his eloquent appeals. I never heard him preach, but his speeches to the boys at the collegiate on our prize days still linger in my memory as marvels of eloquence. His presence was very dignified, and he was stately in manner. He had a profusion of snow-white hair, which added impressiveness and solemnity to his handsome appearance. He wielded a giant's strength in debate, and some thought he used his power without mercy. He died in 1879, at the age of 83. In the 70s, Dr. Forrest, who afterwards became Dean of Worcester, Mr. Lefroy, afterwards Dean of Norwich, and the Reverend Nevison Lorraine, were among our most prominent and eloquent divines, nor must I forget the Reverend John McNaught, of St. Chrysostom's, our first broad churchman, earnest, eloquent, and courageous, but looked upon with much misgiving and some suspicion. The bishops of Chester were unable to devote much of their time to the Liverpool portion of their diocese. The result was that the leaders of the evangelical party became little autocrats in their way. Under these conditions church life became dormant, and the church narrow and formal, and wanting in spirituality. Her liturgy and the devotional part of her services were sacrificed, and made secondary to preaching. This was the state of things in 1880, when the See of Liverpool was founded. Two great influences were, however, quietly operating in the church. The school of the Oxford tract writers gave prominence to the sacramental system and corporate powers of the Church, which enlisted a new class of energies in her service, and the publication of essays and reviews, although they gave a temporary shock to church people, was productive of good, by broadening the theological outlook, and inviting that higher criticism which quickened more interest in the truths of the Bible, and deepened the reverence for the wider conception of the love of God. Dr. Ryle, our first bishop, was a recognized leader of the evangelical party, and a prolific writer of church tracts. He was an able preacher, a good platform speaker after the old-fashioned pattern, and had a very imposing and apostolic presence. Dr. Ryle's work as our first bishop was a difficult and arduous one. He tried to be fair and just to all parties in the church, but he was urged by some of his evangelical followers to take action in restraint of the high church practices which prevailed in some churches, and to give his episcopal sanction to the prosecution of the Rev. J. Belcox. He consented with reluctance. The bishop at this time frequently came to my house, and I know how unhappy he was at this juncture. Not that he in any way sympathized with the practices sought to be checked. They were most repugnant to him. But he appreciated the self-sacrificing work of the high church clergy, and thought that other and gentler means and methods might be adopted to bring about the desired result. In his later years, his lordship's ecclesiastical views became broader and more liberal. In face of many difficulties he did an excellent and most successful work in building churches and schools. Beneath an apparently haughty manner, he had a big and kind heart, and those who were privileged to know him best loved him most. I am sometimes asked, are church people as good and zealous as in the days gone by? I think they are more so. They are more devout, more earnest, more spiritual. They may be less emotional and do not crowd the churches to hear sermons, but they are to be found in their hundreds at the Lord's Supper. The church, which was formerly locked up all week, is now open for daily prayer. The Holy Communion, which was only administered on the first Sunday in the month, is now administered every Sunday, and frequently twice in the day. Strong language and swearing are less frequently heard, and there is in life a diffusion of light and sweetness, which can only come from the influence of holy things and the power of love which has taken a stronger possession of our thoughts and actions. The church is broader, has a wider mission, and it stands upon a higher pinnacle in men's minds. We recognize that men are differently molded in temperament and thought, that a national church must within limits provide the means of worship suitable to all, and that while the simple conventicle may, to some, present the most suitable temple of God, others are happier if their prayers are winged to his throne amid beautiful surroundings and to the sound of choral music. The nonconformists have always been active in Liverpool and have had many able ministers. The most influential of these churches has always been the Unitarian. I remember Dr. Martineau only as a name, but the Rev. Charles Beard I knew and greatly esteemed. He was a power for good in Liverpool, and much of the uplifting and purifying of Liverpool in the 70s was due to his influence. He had powerful supporters amongst his congregation in Renshaw Street Chapel: the Holts, the Rathbones, Gares, Mellies, Gaskells, Thornleys, etc. It has often been said that our university had its birth in Renshaw Street Chapel. It certainly found there its warmest and most active supporters. Hugh Stowell Brown was another bright light among the nonconformists, a robust and rugged preacher, who did not neglect his opportunities of advocating higher ideals of civic life and duty. The Rev. C. M. Birrell, of Pembroke Chapel, was stately in figure and highly cultured. He won the respect and esteem of all Christian communities. The Rev. Charles Garrett was a power in Liverpool and the country, as the great apostle of temperance. In the Roman Catholic Church there is one remarkable outstanding figure, Monsignor Nugent, or as he preferred to be known, Father Nugent, priest, philanthropist, and friend of all, but particularly of the outcast boy and fallen woman. I could write pages of this worthy priest's great goodness, his big heart, his wide and tender sympathies, and his work among the wreckage of society. His memory will linger with us as an incentive to all that is noble, all that is loving and tender. We must not forget the many laymen who have helped forward church work in Liverpool: Charles Langton, Charles Grayson, Christopher Bushell, Hamilton Gilmour, Charles Groves, the builder of churches; Clark Aspinall, who spent all his leisure in assisting the clergy in their church and temperance work; and the Earle family. Among the nonconformists we had W. P. Lockhart, a merchant and an ex-cricketer, who took up evangelistic work in Toxteth Park, and exercised a wide and great influence among young men. I have elsewhere mentioned the Rev. Dr. Lundy and his influence upon the temperance movement, and I must not omit Alexander Balfour, Samuel Smith, and Thomas Matheson, all prominent and most active lay nonconformists. To the active efforts of our clergy we owe much of the improvement in the social condition of our working classes. Their exertions on behalf of temperance are worthy of all praise. In training the young in habits of self-control and self-respect, they are saving the child and making the man who is to control the future destinies of the empire. The building of a cathedral. The See of Liverpool was founded in 1880. There was little difficulty in raising the endowment fund, thanks to the personal exertions of Mr. Torr, M.P., and Mr. Arthur Forwood. But the selection of a bishop was a matter for grave thought. Liverpool contained many Low Churchmen and many Orangemen, and it was also recognized that the High Churchmen had done most excellent work. The views of the evangelical party, however, prevailed, and Lord Sandon and Mr. Whitley were instructed to use every influence with Lord Beaconsfield to secure the appointment of an evangelical churchman. In this they were successful. Lord Beaconsfield appointed Dr. Ryle, whom he had but recently created a dean, as the first bishop of Liverpool. The proposal to erect a cathedral was first made in 1887. A committee was formed. A site on the west side of St. George's Hall, where St. John's Church stood, was selected, and a design by Sir William Emerson was approved by Mr. Ewan Christian, the architectural assessor. I was appointed one of the treasurers to the fund, and at once began an active canvass for donations. There was, however, a great lack of enthusiasm. Many objected to the site chosen, and the bishop did not help the cause, for though he was in a way anxious that a cathedral should be built, he freely expressed his opinion, both in public and in private, that additional churches and mission halls would be more useful. We received promises of only £41,000, and then we had to allow the scheme to drop, for it was quite impossible to make further headway. I think the bishop was disappointed. He was an earnest, good man, and during the episcopate great progress was made in church building in the diocese, but in his heart I do not think he was ever enthusiastic in favour of the cathedral scheme. No further steps were taken towards the erection of a cathedral during the episcopate of Dr. Ryle. When his successor, Dr. Chavas, had been consecrated bishop, the scheme took shape again, and shortly after he had been installed, at his suggestion, a small committee was formed to formulate a proposal. The bishop was good enough to ask me to become the treasurer. I had so ignominiously failed in my first attempt to collect money that I declined, but his lordship was very pressing, and after thinking the matter well over, I said I would make an attempt to start a fund, provided no site was selected and no general committee formed until we had received sufficient promises to make the scheme a success, and I added that if my conditions were accepted, I would give up all other work for 6 weeks and devote myself to working up a cathedral fund. I made those conditions because I found on my previous effort the selection of a site and a design was a serious hindrance, as they afforded reasons and excuses for not giving. The bishop agreed to this proposal. I wrote 6 or 8 begging letters every night, and followed them by a call on the day following, and I wrote a series of articles in the daily press, and managed to arouse a considerable amount of interest and enthusiasm in our scheme. We started our list with a handsome donation of £10,000 each from Lord Derby, Sir Alfred Jones, and others. Canvassing was hard work, but Liverpool people were very good and very generous. In my daily rounds I met with much kindness, but with some disappointments. Only one man, whose father made his millions in Liverpool as a steamship owner, was rude and unpleasant, but even he in the end relieved his conscience by sending in a small donation. At the close of 6 weeks' work, I was able to announce to the Bishop's Committee that we had promises amounting to £168,000. We did not, however, stop at this. The ball was rolling and must be kept rolling, and before we called a halt we had promises in meal or malt amounting to £325,000. In this amount are included special donations for windows, organ, etc. The Earl and Langton families most liberally gave £25,000 towards the cost of the Lady Chapel, and ladies of old Liverpool families were most generous in their contributions. This success would have been impossible of achievement if it had not been for the wonderful influence of the Bishop. Everyone recognized his saintly character, his arduous work, and the statesmanlike manner in which he ruled over his diocese. Perhaps the Bishop's strongest point in dealing with men is his power of enthusing others. He always looks upwards, and in the darkest days is full of brightness and words of encouragement. The next step was the selection of a site, and this aroused considerable discussion. There were many advocates for what was known as the London Road site, at the junction of that thoroughfare and Pembroke Place, a very commanding position. But as the cost of the site alone would have been £150,000, it was placed on one side. The sites of St. Peter's and St. Luke's were considered and pronounced too small. Eventually St. James' Mount was decided upon as being central and commanding, and having picturesque surroundings. The 14 acres comprising the Mount were purchased from the corporation for £20,000. It was decided to advertise for designs and give premiums for the two best, and Mr. Norman Shaw, R.A., and Mr. Bodley, R.A., were appointed assessors. Many designs were sent in and exhibited at the Walker Art Gallery. From these the assessors selected the design of Mr. Gilbert Scott, a young man of only 19, a grandson of the great Gothic architect Sir Gilbert Scott, R.A. It was a design which did not commend itself entirely to the committee, and Mr. Scott being a Roman Catholic, it was feared some objection might be taken, and the committee very wisely decided to link Mr. Bodley, R.A., with Mr. Scott as joint architects. A very happy combination, for while we secured the genius of Mr. Scott, we also secured the ripe experience and exquisite taste of Mr. Bodley. We elected the Earl of Derby as our president, and I was made the chairman of the executive committee, a position of much honour and of absorbing interest, but involving considerable responsibility. We were fortunate in having on the committee Mr. Arthur Earle, who has rendered yeoman service both in collecting funds and finding donors of the windows. We have also received great assistance from Mr. Robert Gladstone, the deputy chairman, and Mr. F. M. Radcliffe. We had some difficulty with our foundations, as part of the mount was made ground, and the rock when we reached it was very friable. The consequence was that on the east side we had to go down 40 and even 50 feet before we obtained a satisfactory foundation. The foundations for the choir, Lady Chapel, vestries, and chapter house cost £40,000. Foundation Stone Laid by the King. It was decided to invite the King and Queen to lay the foundation stone, as it was the only cathedral likely to be built in this century. The King graciously consented, and fixed the afternoon of July 19th, 1904, for the ceremony, the arrangement being that he was to come down from London in the morning, lunch with the Lord Mayor at the Town Hall, and afterwards lay the foundation stone, and on the conclusion of the ceremony embark upon the royal yacht in the river to proceed to Cardiff, en route to open the waterworks constructed in South Wales for the supply of Birmingham. The arrangements for the foundation stone laying required much thought, as my experience has taught me that functions are successful only if every detail is well thought out beforehand. Around the foundation stone a huge amphitheatre of wood was constructed, capable of seating 7,000 persons, and in the center we erected an ornamental dais upon which the King and Queen were received, and where they stood during the religious service, and in front of the dais, about 30 feet away, the foundation stone stood ready for lifting and laying. We also formed a choir of 1,000 voices to take the musical part of the service, led by the band of the Coldstream Guards. The day was beautifully fine, and the city splendidly decorated, quite a royal day. Lord Derby and the High Sheriff met their Majesties on their arrival at the Lime Street Station, when presentations were made to their Majesties. The King was in the uniform of an Admiral of the Fleet. Lord Derby appeared as Lord Lieutenant, and uniforms and court dress were worn by the guests. Their Majesties proceeded from the station to the Town Hall, where a very select company was assembled. After luncheon the King knighted the Lord Mayor, who became Sir Robert Hampson. At Lord Derby's request I proceeded to the site to receive their Majesties on their arrival, and afterwards had the honour of presenting the architects and the members of the committee. The service was conducted by the Archbishop of York and the Bishops of Liverpool and Chester. It was grand and majestic, worthy of the occasion. Most of the bishops of the northern province were present in their robes, and also about 300 of the clergy. At the conclusion of the service the King expressed to me his great satisfaction, and the Queen did the same, adding that the music was beautifully rendered. Everything passed off well, but during the service heavy banks of clouds began to gather, and the royal party had scarcely left the site when the rain fell. Consecration of the Lady Chapel. The consecration of the Lady Chapel took place on Wednesday, the 29th of June, 1910, St. Peter's Day, and was a most imposing and impressive ceremony. The Lord Bishop conducted the service, the Archbishop of York preached the sermon, and they were supported by the Archbishop of Dublin and 24 other bishops, all wearing their convocation robes. There was a large assembly, the difficulty being to accommodate all who wished for seats. The bishop's procession was formed in the vestries, and was composed of the chapter and clergy, the cathedral choir, the bishops and their chaplains, the bishop of the diocese, and the Archbishop of York. The procession marched round the chapel through the street to the door of the Lady Chapel, the choir singing an appropriate anthem. Arriving at the door, after the recital of some prayers, the bishop knocked demanding admission. Upon entering the church, the Earl of Derby, the President, in his Chancellor's robes, and attended by Mr. Arthur Earle, Mr. Gladstone, Mr. Radcliffe, Sir Robert Hampson, and myself, as the chairman, advanced and handed the bishop a request that he would consecrate the chapel, and also a deed conveying the chapel and its site to the bishop and the chapter. The procession then proceeded to their places in the choir, and the service commenced, the musical part being beautifully rendered by the choir. Mr. Burstall presiding at the organ. The service was interesting and quaint, especially the blessing by the different bishops of the various votive offerings. The Archbishop preached a most eloquent sermon, taking as his text Habakkuk's 2nd chapter, 20th verse, "The Lord is in his holy temple, let the whole earth keep silence." The consecration was followed by a luncheon at the town hall. An octave of special services was held in the chapel in the following week, at which several bishops preached. This is not the place to describe the architectural features of the Lady Chapel, but it seems to have won the admiration of all by its charming proportions, its chaste but rich beauty, and its quiet devotional feeling. The gifts to the chapel by the Earle and Langton families were both numerous and costly, and of the total cost of the chapel, about £70,000, these families generously contributed nearly one half. Their offerings were supplemented by those of other friends, so that the chapel, when opened, was complete in every detail, and with every accessory. To the Dowager Countess of Derby and her committee of lady workers, with Miss Stolterfolt as secretary, we are indebted for the beautiful embroideries which do so much for the adornment and enrichment of the choir. We launched this first and great installment of the cathedral, "in humble thankfulness to Almighty God that He has prospered our handiwork, and pray that in this holy and beautiful house prayer and praise may be ever offered unto Him, that He will assist with His blessing our effort to complete the cathedral for His glory, that He will endue with wisdom the heads that guide, preserve from evil the hands that work, provide the silver and gold, and carry to a glorious completion the building thus begun." York House of Convocation. In 1902 the Lord Bishop was good enough to nominate me as a member of Convocation. We met at York once each year, when the clergy held their meetings within the precincts of the cathedral, and the laymen in a temperance hall. Our debates were purely academical and bore no fruit, and no notice was taken of us by the Archbishop or the cathedral authorities. If the clergy and laity were to meet together, Convocation would have a reality and a value, for if nothing should come of their public discussions, they would at least get to know each other, and an interchange of ideas could not be otherwise than advantageous to both. Under the rule of Archbishop Lang, I have no doubt Convocation will become a very valuable institution. Church Congress. The opportunity was afforded me to take part in several meetings of the Church Congress. At some I read papers, and at others I was a special speaker. The most interesting congress was the one held in Exeter in 1894, when I was the guest of Bishop Bickersteth, at the Palace. The other guests at the Palace were Dr. Temple, then Bishop of London; Dr. Wordsworth, Bishop of Salisbury; Dr. Gott, Bishop of Truro; and Lord Cross. We were all much interested with the rugged intellectual power of the Bishop of London. His epigrammatic utterances interjected into our after-dinner talk were full of wisdom, and often bubbled over with quiet, quaint humour. Many stories were told of the bishop when he was Bishop of Exeter, of the kindness which was concealed under his brusque, outspoken manner, and his remarkable influence for good. He delivered at Exeter a striking and very forcible address upon temperance. His eyesight was already very defective, and Mrs. Temple had to lead him about. To the surprise of everybody, he not only became Archbishop of Canterbury, but will also be remembered as one of our great archbishops. New York Cathedral. When in New York I had the opportunity of visiting their cathedral, the construction of which had been recently commenced. The clerk of the works took me into a room to show me the model of the cathedral, and he also showed me a list of cathedrals with their principal dimensions. At the foot of the list came the New York Cathedral, the largest of all. I said to him, "You have forgotten one cathedral, the Liverpool Cathedral." He replied, "So I have. Where will it come?" I told him to put it at the bottom. He looked at me for a few moments in evident surprise, and said, "Is it to be larger than New York?" And on my answering yes, he replied, "Oh, we will make that all right. We will add another bay to our nave." I thought this was truly American, a determination not to be beaten. End of section 15.